The sound of tearing fabric echoed through celestial gardens like a gunshot. Every head in the five-star restaurant turned toward table 14, where Margaret Ashford, draped in pearls and privilege, stood with her manicured hand still gripping the torn hem of a black waitress's uniform. The fabric hung in shreds, exposing Kenya Morris's bare shoulder and the faded scar that ran across her collarbone. "You clumsy animal," Margaret hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Do you have any idea how much this Chanel dress costs?" "More than you'll make in a lifetime." Kenya stood frozen, her tray of champagne flutes still balanced perfectly in her left hand despite the assault. Not a single glass had fallen. Her face remained a mask of practiced composure, but her dark eyes flickered with something deeper, not shame, but a quiet calculation. "Ma'am, I apologize," Kenya said, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning through her chest. "I'll cover the cleaning costs from my paycheck." Margaret laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the hushed whispers spreading across the restaurant. "Cleaning? This dress is ruined. $12,000 and you think your pathetic salary will cover it?" What Margaret Ashford didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as she stood there in her designer heels and her husband's money, was that the woman she'd just assaulted wasn't just a waitress. Kenya Morris held 3 degrees, spoke 4 languages, and had once managed a portfolio worth more than Margaret's entire jewelry collection. But life has a way of humbling even the strongest, and Kenya's fall from grace had been swift and merciless. "Margaret, that's enough." The voice came from behind them, deep and commanding. David Ashford stood from table 12, where he'd been conducting a business dinner with 3 Japanese investors. His steel gray eyes locked onto his wife with an expression that made several nearby diners uncomfortable. This wasn't the affable billionaire real estate mogul they'd read about in Forbes. This was something colder, harder. "David, darling, this incompetent waitress I saw everything." He cut her off, his tone flat. "You grabbed her arm when she was walking past, then deliberately tore her uniform." The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The soft jazz piano in the corner had stopped mid-note. Even the kitchen sounds had faded to nothing. Margaret's face flushed red beneath her expensive makeup. "That's not... I would never..." "Security footage." David nodded toward the discreet cameras mounted in the corners. "This restaurant has them everywhere." "I should know. I own the building." Kenya's eyes widened slightly. She'd worked at Celestial Gardens for 8 months and had never known the building's owner. Managers came and went, corporate emails arrived from faceless executives, but the actual owner? That was a mystery wrapped in LLC paperwork and offshore accounts. David approached his wife slowly, deliberately. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet enough that only those nearby could hear, but the words carried weight. "You will apologize to Miss Morris. You will write her a check for $10,000 as compensation for assault and public humiliation, and then you will leave because I'm filing for divorce tomorrow morning." The gasp that rippled through the restaurant was audible. Margaret's face went from red to white in an instant. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "Over some black waitress?" The silence that followed was deafening. David's jaw clenched, and for a moment Kenya thought he might actually strike his wife. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He laughed, a bitter, exhausted sound that seemed to carry years of pent-up frustration. "No, Margaret. Not because of her, because I've watched you belittle, demean, and destroy people for 23 years, and I'm done pretending your cruelty is sophistication." He turned to Kenya. "I'm sorry you had to endure that, Miss Morris. Please send any medical bills or therapy costs to my office. Jackson will handle it." A man in an impeccable suit materialized from nowhere, clearly David's assistant, and handed Kenya a business card. But Kenya didn't take it. Instead, she did something that would later become legendary in the service industry circles of Manhattan. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her entire face, and set her tray down with practiced grace. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice no longer subservient but measured and professional, "I appreciate your intervention, but I don't need charity. What I need is justice." David studied her with renewed interest. Justice. Your wife assaulted me in front of 47 witnesses. I'd like to press charges. Kenya straightened her torn uniform with as much dignity as a queen adjusting her crown. And I'd like to sue her for emotional distress, assault, and defamation of character. Margaret made a strangled sound. You ungrateful. Furthermore, Kenya continued, ignoring her completely, I'll be filing a formal complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission about the hostile work environment I've endured here for 8 months. The racist comments, the deliberate assignment of the worst sections, the theft of my tips by certain managers who assumed I wouldn't fight back because I'm— What was it you called me, Mrs. Ashford? A clumsy animal? The manager, Thornton, who'd been hovering nervously by the kitchen doors, went pale. David's expression shifted from sympathy to something Kenya couldn't quite read. Respect, maybe? Curiosity? You're serious. Deadly serious, sir, and before you offer me money to make this go away quietly, you should know something. Kenya reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small recording device. I've been documenting everything for 6 months, every slur, every stolen tip, every deliberately humiliating task. I came to work here specifically because I knew this place had a reputation for exactly this kind of behavior. The restaurant erupted in whispers. Phones came out. Videos that had been secretly recording the confrontation were now being uploaded to social media in real time. You set this up? Margaret shrieked. You wanted this to happen. I wanted justice, Kenya corrected. I wanted proof that places like this still exist, that people like you still feel entitled to treat service workers as less than human. And now I have it. David stared at her for a long moment, then did something that shocked everyone present. He started clapping, slow, deliberate applause that echoed through the stunned silence. Miss Morris, he said, still clapping, I think I'd like to hire you. Kenya blinked. Excuse me? Not as a waitress, as a consultant. You've just executed one of the most brilliant undercover operations I've seen in 20 years of business. The documentation, the patience, the strategic thinking, I need that on my team. This is insane. Margaret grabbed her purse, her hands shaking. You're all insane. I'm leaving. Yes, you are, David agreed. Security will escort you. And Margaret, don't come back to any property I own. That's 63 buildings across Manhattan, in case you forgot. As Margaret was led away by 2 security guards, her designer heels clicking furiously against the marble floor, David turned back to Kenya. I mean it about the job offer. But first, let's deal with your lawsuit. I'll provide my legal team, pro bono. They'll make sure Mrs. Ashford and this establishment face every consequence they deserve. Kenya studied him carefully. Why? Because 23 years ago, I married a woman who I thought was sophisticated and cultured. It took me 2 decades to realize that cruelty and class don't belong in the same sentence. He glanced at the other diners, many still recording. And because it's the right thing to do, finally. The Japanese investors at his table stood and approached. The eldest bowed slightly to Kenya. Miss Morris, in Japan we have a saying, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. But sometimes that nail is actually a pillar holding everything up. You are that pillar. Kenya felt something break inside her chest, not from pain, but from the sudden release of 8 months of accumulated humiliation, rage, and determination. She'd come to Celestial Gardens on a mission, yes, but she'd also come because she'd had nowhere else to go. The consulting firm she'd built from nothing had collapsed during the pandemic. Her savings had evaporated. Pride had kept her from asking for help, and necessity had driven her here, to this overpriced restaurant where racism hid behind $3 signs and sommelier recommendations. I'll consider your offer, Mr. Ashford, she said finally. But first, I need to change my uniform and file those charges and possibly have a very long cry in the employee bathroom. David smiled, a real smile this time, not the practiced business expression. Take all the time you need. The bathroom's all yours. And Miss Morris, thank you for reminding me why I got into this business in the first place. It wasn't to make money. It was to build something worth believing in. As Kenya walked toward the back, past staring diners and shocked coworkers, she felt the weight of 8 months lifting from her shoulders. The torn uniform flapped against her back with each step, But she didn't care. She'd won. Not because a billionaire had defended her, though that helped, but because she'd defended herself first. In the employee bathroom, alone finally, Kenya looked at herself in the mirror. The scar on her collarbone was visible through the torn fabric, a reminder of the car accident that had killed her husband and nearly killed her 3 years ago. The scar she usually kept hidden, the scar Margaret Ashford had exposed to the world. But as she stared at her reflection, Kenya realized something profound. She'd been hiding more than just a scar. She'd been hiding herself, her competence, her intelligence, her worth, behind uniforms and forced smiles and the protective armor of invisibility. Not anymore. Kenya pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 8 months. Her sister answered on the first ring. "Maya," Kenya said, her voice breaking slightly. "You were right. I'm ready. Start looking for office space. We're rebuilding the firm." "Oh my God, Kenya, what happened?" Kenya laughed, a sound of pure relief. "Everything. I'll tell you later. But Maya, this time we're doing it right. No compromise, no hiding, no pretending to be less than we are to make others comfortable." "I've been waiting 3 years to hear you say that." As Kenya ended the call, she heard a soft knock on the bathroom door. "Miss Morris?" It was David's assistant, Jackson. "Mr. Ashford wanted me to give you these." Kenya opened the door to find Jackson holding a designer shopping bag. Inside was a complete outfit, elegant, professional, expensive, along with a handwritten note. "For your fresh start. First consultant meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Come as yourself, not as who you think we want to see. -D." A quote. Kenya looked up at Jackson, who was smiling. "He told me your size from the employee files. I hope I got it right." "It's perfect," Kenya whispered. "Tell him I'll be there." As Jackson left, Kenya changed out of her torn uniform and into the new clothes. They fit perfectly. In the mirror, she no longer saw a waitress trying to hide her past. She saw a consultant, an entrepreneur, a survivor who'd just reminded herself, and a restaurant full of witnesses, that dignity isn't something that can be torn away like cheap fabric. It's something you carry inside, unbreakable, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to the world. The elevator to the 47th floor of Ashford Tower moved so smoothly Kenya barely felt the ascent. She watched the numbers climb, 25, 30, 35, each floor representing millions of dollars in real estate, investment portfolios, and corporate power she'd once understood intimately, but had been locked out of for 3 years. The new outfit David had sent fit like armor, charcoal gray suit, silk blouse the color of midnight, heels that added 3 inches to her height and 10 years of confidence to her posture. When the elevator doors opened, she didn't walk into the reception area, she commanded it. "Miss Morris." Jackson appeared immediately, his smile genuine. "Right on time. Mr. Ashford is finishing a call, but he asked me to give you these." He handed her a tablet and a thick folder. "Background on the consultation project. You'll want to review it before the meeting." Kenya took the materials to a waiting area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. As she opened the folder, her breath caught. Inside were detailed reports on every property in the Ashford portfolio, not the public information available to investors, but internal audits, employee complaints, revenue breakdowns, and a section that made her pulse quicken. Systemic issues in service industry holdings. She was reading about herself, about Celestial Gardens, but also about 12 other restaurants, 4 hotels, and 2 country clubs where complaints had been filed, settled quietly, and buried under NDAS and payouts. "Jesus," Kenya whispered. The pattern was clear. Managers hired based on connections rather than competence. Service staff, predominantly Black, Latino, and Asian, subjected to racist comments, wage theft, and hostile conditions. Corporate turning a blind eye because the properties were profitable. "Disgusting, isn't it?" David's voice came from behind her. Kenya turned to find him standing in the doorway of his office, looking tired despite the expensive suit. "You knew all this was happening?" "I knew complaints were filed. I didn't know the extent until last night." He gestured for her to follow him inside. "After what happened with Margaret, I had my team pull every HR file, every settlement, every internal report from the last 5 years. What you experienced wasn't an isolated incident. It was company culture." His office was surprisingly simple for a billionaire. No ostentatious art, no gold fixtures, just clean lines, comfortable furniture, and more windows that made Manhattan look like a model city he could rearrange at will. "Why show me this?" Kenya asked, setting the folder on his desk. "If you're trying to buy my silence." "I'm trying to fix it," David interrupted. "And I can't do that without someone who understands the problem from the inside." He sat across from her, not behind his desk, a deliberate choice that didn't go unnoticed. "Miss Morris, I built this company over 30 years, started with one building, a construction loan, and a willingness to work 18-hour days. Somewhere along the way, I stopped paying attention to what was happening at ground level. I surrounded myself with people who told me what I wanted to hear, married a woman who valued status over humanity, and convinced myself that profit margins were the only metrics that mattered." Kenya studied him carefully. "And now you want redemption?" "I want accountability. There's a difference." David pulled out another folder, this one thinner. "I'm creating a new position, Director of Equity and Culture, full authority to investigate, terminate, restructure, whatever it takes to clean house, 7-figure salary, complete autonomy, and a direct line to me that bypasses every other executive." Kenya's heart hammered. "You're offering this to me?" "After reviewing your background, yes. MIT graduate, dual degrees in business and psychology, built a consulting firm from scratch that specialized in organizational culture before the pandemic hit. References from clients that read like love letters. Miss Morris, you're not just qualified. You're the only person I trust to do this without letting me hide from uncomfortable truths. You don't know me. I know you spent 8 months documenting abuse instead of quitting. I know you stood up to my wife in front of 47 witnesses. I know you're still here instead of taking a settlement and disappearing." David leaned forward. "And I know that when I searched your name last night, I found a TED Talk you gave 4 years ago about systemic racism in corporate America. You weren't just living undercover at Celestial Gardens. You were conducting research." Kenya felt exposed. The TED Talk had been viewed 2.3 million times, but she'd never connected it to her waitressing identity. Different hair, different name on the employee files. She'd used her middle name, Morris, instead of her married name. "My husband died 3 years ago," Kenya said quietly. "Car accident. I was driving. Survived with a shattered collarbone and survivor's guilt that destroyed everything I'd built. The consulting firm collapsed because I couldn't function. Clients left, partners walked away. I ended up working at Celestial Gardens because I needed to prove to myself that I could still stand up, show up, exist without falling apart. And you chose a place where you knew you'd face the worst humanity has to offer. I chose a place where I could matter again, even if it was just getting someone their steak cooked right." Kenya swallowed hard. "But then your wife tore my uniform, and I remembered something my husband used to say. The world only changes when someone refuses to accept it as it is." David was quiet for a long moment. "Take the job." "I haven't said yes yet." "I know. That's why I'm asking instead of assuming." He slid a contract across the table. "Read it. Take it to a lawyer. Negotiate. But Kenya," may I call you Kenya? "I need you. This company needs you. And based on that folder, about 3,000 service workers across my properties need you." Kenya picked up the contract, scanning the terms. The salary was staggering. The authority was unprecedented. But what caught her attention was a clause on page 7. "Director maintains full discretion to terminate any employee, including C-suite executives, without board approval if evidence of discriminatory behavior is substantiated." "You're giving me power to fire anyone?" Kenya looked up sharply. "Including yourself?" David smiled grimly. "Especially myself. If I'm part of the problem, I should face consequences too." "That's corporate suicide. Or corporate integrity. I'm betting on the latter." David stood and walked to the window. 23 years ago, I married Margaret because she fit the image I thought I needed. Society wife, right connections, perfect pedigree. I ignored every red flag, the way she spoke to service staff, the casual racism disguised as just joking, the belief that money made her inherently superior. I enabled her by staying silent. And now you're divorced and feeling guilty. Now I'm divorced and feeling responsible. There's a difference. David turned back to face her. Margaret was a symptom, not the disease. The disease is a system that rewards cruelty as long as it's profitable, that excuses racism as long as it's subtle, that allows people like me to claim ignorance while cashing checks built on other people's suffering. Kenya stood slowly, contract in hand. If I take this job, I won't be subtle. I won't protect your reputation. And I won't stop until every person who enabled this culture is gone, even if it means burning your whole corporate structure to the ground and rebuilding from scratch. David met her gaze without flinching. Good. That's exactly what I'm hiring you for. Then I need 3 things before I sign. Name them. First, I want Margaret Ashford charged and prosecuted, not just sued in civil court. What she did was assault, and I want it on record. Kenya's voice was steel. Second, I want Thornton, the manager at Celestial Gardens, fired today, along with any other manager who has multiple complaints in their file. Third, I want a public apology from this company to every service worker who filed a complaint in the last 5 years, along with additional compensation beyond whatever settlements they received. David didn't hesitate. Done, done, and done. Jackson will handle the details. Anything else? Yes. I want my sister Maya hired as deputy director. She's got the same credentials I do, and I need someone I trust watching my back when I start making enemies. Consider it done. David extended his hand. Welcome to Ashford Holdings, Director Morris. Kenya shook his hand, feeling the weight of what she'd just agreed to. This wasn't just a job. It was a war against a system that had chewed her up and spit her out, that had killed her husband through systemic negligence, drunk driver, son of a wealthy family, charges reduced through expensive lawyers, and that continued to destroy lives daily while hiding behind corporate speak and shareholder value. One more thing, Kenya said as she turned to leave. I'm going to need access to every settlement agreement, every NDA, every complaint that was buried. And I'm going to contact every single person who signed them and offer them a chance to speak publicly without legal consequences. David's expression was unreadable. That could cost millions in legal fees and reputation damage. I know. Are you backing out? No. David smiled, a real smile that made him look younger, less burdened. I'm just impressed. You're going to be excellent at this job even if you destroy me in the process. Especially if I destroy you in the process, Kenya corrected. That's how accountability works. As she left his office, contract in hand and purpose in her heart, Kenya felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. Not naive hope that everything would be easy, but warrior's hope, the kind that comes from knowing the fight ahead will be brutal, but that she's finally armed with the weapons to win it. The elevator descended, and with each floor, Kenya's mind raced with plans. First, Celestial Gardens, complete staff interviews, salary audits, managerial restructuring. Then the other properties, then industry-wide change. Her phone buzzed, a text from Maya. Whatever you're doing, I can feel the universe shifting. Call me. Kenya smiled and typed back, how do you feel about burning down a corporate empire and rebuilding it with actual integrity? Maya's response was instant. I've been waiting my whole life for you to ask me that. 6 months after Kenya, Morris signed her contract. Ashford Holdings was unrecognizable. The first casualty had been Thornton, fired within 24 hours along with 7 other managers across various properties. The second wave hit harder. 3 executives, including the VP of Human Resources who'd been systematically burying complaints for 8 years. By month 3, Kenya had restructured compensation across all waitress positions, implemented mandatory anti-racism training, and personally interviewed over 400 employees. By month 6, she'd become the most feared woman in Manhattan's hospitality industry. They're calling you the executioner in the trade journals, Maya said, dropping a stack of business magazines on Kenya's new desk, an office 3 doors down from David's, with the same floor-to-ceiling windows and none of the hesitation she'd felt 6 months ago. Kenya glanced at the headlines. Ashford Holdings radical restructuring. Can corporate culture really change? And her personal favorite, the waitress who became a kingmaker. Kingmaker, Kenya scoffed. I'm not making kings. I'm removing them. Speaking of which, we have a problem. Maya pulled up a file on her tablet. Richard Vandermeer, CEO of Celestial Gardens Group. You remember the restaurant chain David acquired last year? The one fighting our equity initiatives? That's putting it mildly. He's filed a lawsuit claiming wrongful termination of his staff violates his management contract, and he's hired Margaret Ashford's lawyer. Kenya looked up sharply. Margaret's out of rehab? As of last week, and apparently ready for round 2. Maya hesitated. Kenya, there's something else. She's giving interviews, claiming you orchestrated everything to trap her, that you're a con artist who manipulated David into hiring you. For a moment, Kenya felt the old weight pressing down, the survivor's guilt, the imposter syndrome, the voice that whispered she didn't deserve to be here. Then she remembered the scar on her collarbone, the torn uniform, the 8 months of documented abuse. Let her talk, Kenya said quietly. Words can't hurt me anymore. I've got something better than words. What's that? Evidence and subpoena power. The lawsuit hearing was set for a Friday morning in a Manhattan courthouse that had seen its share of corporate battles. Kenya arrived in a burgundy suit that Maya had picked out. Bold, professional, unmissable. David was already there with his legal team, looking tense. They're going to argue you exceeded your authority, David warned as they walked in, that I gave you too much power too quickly, that you're personally motivated rather than professionally objective. They're right, Kenya said simply. I am personally motivated. I'm motivated by every person who's been treated as less than human because of their skin color. I'm motivated by the memory of my husband who died because a wealthy family could buy their son's freedom. I'm motivated by 3 years of rebuilding myself from nothing. And if that makes me unprofessional, then I guess I'm unprofessional. David smiled despite the tension. Remind me never to be on your bad side. Too late. Everyone's on my bad side until they prove otherwise. Inside the courtroom, Richard Vandermeer sat with his legal team, 3 lawyers in identical navy suits, all looking like they'd been born holding gavels. Margaret Ashford was in the front row behind them, wearing white like some kind of twisted angel, her expression radiating vindication. The judge, a black woman in her 60s named Justice Sarah Okonkwo, reviewed the case files with an expression that gave nothing away. This is a wrongful termination suit complicated by allegations of corporate overreach and personal vendetta. Mr. Vandermeer, your opening statement. Vandermeer's lead lawyer stood. Your Honor, this case is simple. Miss Morris, hired under questionable circumstances after allegedly orchestrating an incident with Mrs. Ashford, was given unprecedented power within Ashford Holdings. She then used that power to systematically terminate experienced managers, including my client's entire leadership team at Celestial Gardens, based on complaints that were already settled through proper HR channels. This isn't reform, it's revenge. Kenya felt Maya tense beside her, but she remained still. Let them talk. Let them reveal exactly who they are. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, we have evidence that Miss Morris specifically targeted establishments where she could manufacture conflicts to justify her own hiring. She worked undercover at Celestial Gardens, not as a victim, but as an instigator. That's a serious accusation, Justice Okonkwo noted. Do you have evidence? We do. Testimony from former employees who claim Miss Morris deliberately provoked confrontations, recordings of her discussing her research project with colleagues, and financial analysis showing her consulting firm was bankrupt before this convenient employment opportunity arose. The courtroom buzzed. Kenya felt eyes on her. Judgment, curiosity, schadenfreude. She'd expected this, prepared for it. The accused black woman, too angry, too ambitious, too unwilling to stay in her place. Miss Morris, the judge said, how do you respond? Kenya stood slowly, deliberately. Your Honor, may I approach? You may. Kenya walked to the bench and handed the judge a tablet. This contains documentation of 1,247 complaints filed across Ashford Holdings properties over the past 8 years. Complaints about racism, sexual harassment, wage theft, and hostile work environments. Of those 1,247 complainants, exactly 12 resulted in any disciplinary action. The rest were settled with NDAS and payouts that averaged $8,000, just enough to silence people who couldn't afford lawyers. She turned to face the courtroom. Yes, I worked undercover at Celestial Gardens. Yes, I documented abuse. And yes, I provoked nothing. I simply existed as a black woman in a space that believed my existence was provocative enough to justify assault. Margaret stood up. That's not— Mrs. Ashford, sit down, Justice Okonkwo ordered sharply. Kenya continued. Mr. Vandermeer's team claims I exceeded my authority by firing his managers. Let's talk about those managers. Daniel Frost, terminated for stealing $47,000 in employee tips over 2 years. Rebecca Chan, terminated for 18 documented instances of racial slurs toward staff. Michael Torres, terminated for sexually harassing 3 hostesses, all of whom were threatened with termination if they reported it. She pulled out more documents. These terminations weren't revenge. They were justice, something this industry has avoided for decades by hiding behind settlements and silence. Vandermeer's lawyer objected. Your Honor, these are internal documents that I have every legal right to access as Director of Equity and Culture, Kenya interrupted, a position that exists specifically because people like you convinced people like Mr. Ashford that profits matter more than humanity. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Justice Okonkwo banged her gavel. Order. Miss Morris, are you claiming systemic discrimination across the entire Ashford Holdings portfolio? I'm not claiming it, Your Honor. I'm proving it. Kenya nodded to Maya, who pulled up a presentation on the courtroom screens. Over the past 6 months, my team interviewed 2,100 current and former employees. We found that Black and Latino workers were paid, on average, 23% less than white workers in identical positions. We found that 67% of Black employees reported experiencing racism at work, compared to 3% of white employees. We found that management positions were 89% white, despite service staff being 71% people of color. The numbers filled the screen, undeniable and damning. This isn't about one restaurant or one manager, Kenya said, her voice rising with conviction. This is about an industry built on the assumption that certain people are worth less than others. And when someone like me dares to challenge that assumption, we're called angry, vindictive, opportunistic. Because how dare we demand dignity? She turned to Margaret. Mrs. Ashford tore my uniform because she believed she had the right to, not because I did anything wrong, but because in her world I was already wrong just by existing in her space. And when I refused to accept that, when I documented and spoke up and fought back, I became dangerous. Not because I was dishonest, but because I was too honest. Justice Okonkwo was watching her intently now. Mr. Vandermeer, do you have documentation refuting these statistics? The lawyer shuffled papers nervously. Your Honor, we dispute the methodology. Do you have documentation? The judge repeated. No, Your Honor. But then this court finds in favor of Miss Morris and Ashford Holdings. The terminations were justified, the restructuring was within her contractual authority, and Mr. Vandermeer's lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. Justice Okonkwo looked directly at Kenya. Miss Morris, I don't often say this from the bench, but what you're doing matters. Don't stop. The gavel fell. Kenya felt Maya grab her hand, felt David's relieved exhale behind her. But what she noticed most was Margaret's face, pale, defeated, finally understanding that money couldn't buy immunity from consequences forever. As they left the courtroom, reporters swarmed. Miss Morris, how does it feel to win? Are you planning to expand your reforms to other companies? Do you have a message for other corporations? Kenya stopped at the courthouse steps, Maya and David flanking her. She looked directly into the cameras. My message is simple. The age of silence is over. For too long, industries have profited from inequality and hidden behind legal settlements. No more. If you're running a company built on exploitation, I'm coming for you. Not with lawsuits. though I'll use those too, but with truth, with numbers, with the voices of every person you tried to silence. She paused, feeling the weight of her words. And to everyone watching who's ever been told they're too much, too angry, too ambitious, too unwilling to accept their place, you're exactly enough. The world doesn't need you smaller, it needs you louder. 6 months later, the Kenya Morris Standard became industry shorthand for comprehensive equity reform. 12 major corporations adopted similar positions. 3 CEOs resigned under pressure, and Celestial Gardens, under new management, became the first restaurant in its class to achieve full pay equity and zero tolerance for discrimination. David stepped down as CEO, transitioning to chairman, while Kenya took operational control of all Ashford Holdings service properties. Maya expanded their model into hospitality training programs nationwide. And Kenya? She finally visited her husband's grave with news worth sharing. "I found my voice again," she whispered, touching the headstone. "The one you always said was too powerful to hide. It's still angry sometimes, still imperfect, but it's mine, and I'm using it to make sure no one else has to whisper through their pain like I did." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, carrying warmth despite the autumn chill. Somewhere in the city behind her, 3,000 service workers were clocking in for shifts at properties that now honored their humanity. And somewhere ahead, a broken industry was finally, slowly, beginning to heal. Because one woman refused to stay torn.